am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. I am Professor Nancy Sinkoff, the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and a Professor of Jewish Studies and History here at Rutgers. Let me give you the ground rules. You may be familiar because we've all become experts in Zoom, but let me make sure that you know how we're going to proceed today. In this webinar format, all of the attendees, we have almost 400 people on the call, are muted. If you have questions, and we welcome them, please type them into the chat, and the icon for the chat is at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. Professor Shandler and Professor Lambert will be in conversation about Professor Chandler's new book. I will say more about both of them in a minute. But you should know that we welcome your questions throughout the discussion, and then I will moderate them at the end. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Bildner Center website after the technology wizards convert it into a usable digital form. Now let me introduce our speakers. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Jeffrey Shandler, who is Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers, New Brunswick. He's been my colleague here for over 20 years, and he is also affiliated with the Department of Comparative Literature. Professor Shandler earned his PhD in Yiddish Studies from Columbia University and has been a visiting scholar at many universities, including the Australian Center for Jewish Civilization at Monash University, the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard, the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a prolific author, editor, and translator. He has published widely in his field of Yiddish studies, including Yiddish language and culture, Holocaust representation, religion, and media. Let me just mention a few of his more recent publications. Adventures in Yiddish Land, Post-Vernacular Yiddish Language and Culture, 2005. Shtetl, A Vernacular Intellectual History, 2014. Holocaust Memory in the Digital Age, Survivors' Stories and New Media Practices, 2017. He is also the editor of Awakening Lives, Autobiographies of Jewish Youth in Poland Before the Holocaust, and translator of Emil and Karl, a Holocaust novel for young readers written by the great Yiddish poet Yankov Glatstein, which was published in 2006. He has also translated some other Yiddish children's literature, including Yingel Zwinkel Chvat. And anywhere you look in the world of Yiddish cultural representation and you want a way to understand it, I direct you to Professor Shandler's publications. I'm going to hold up, I hope you can see it, his new, wonderful new book, Yiddish, Biography of a Language. And you can see the outline and micrography of the great 20th century Yiddish writer, Yudlemed Peretz. So Professor Shandler will speak soon, but I want to introduce his discussant, my colleague, Joshua Lambert, my colleague in the broadest sense, not here at Rutgers, but at Wellesley. Professor Josh Lambert is the Sophia Moses Robison Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and English and Director of the Jewish Studies program at Wellesley College. He received his PhD in English Literature and Language from the University of Michigan. He also worked for a few years at the National Yiddish Book Center, really enlarging its public education in terms of Yiddish language and literature. He is the author of American Jewish Fiction, a JPS guide, and he's also the author of a monograph, Unclean Lips, Obscenity, Jews, and American Culture. He has also edited with Ilan Stefan's How Yiddish Changed America and How America Changed Yiddish, which was published in this pandemic year. So now I'm going to turn the Zoom room pixelated boxes over to my colleagues, Professor Jeffrey Shandler and Professor Joshua Lambert. Please ask your questions in the chat, and we welcome you.
Thank you so much. It's really an incredible pleasure to, I want to say be here. I don't want to say be here, but to be discussing this book, which is really just incredibly wonderful contribution to the field. Thank you to Nancy Sinkoff for inviting me, and to Jeffrey Shandler for thinking of me as someone to talk about this book with, two scholars I admire so very much. So without wasting any more time, I want to ask the question of how you came to write a book in this sort of unusual way. We don't normally think of writing biographies of languages, or at least I don't think that way. And I'd like to, I think it would be helpful for everyone if you would just give us a sense of how this project came to be and how it took shape.
Well, thank you, Josh. And before I answer your question, as we say in Yiddish, before I speak, I'd like to say a few words, and those are words of thanks. I want to thank everyone for coming to Zoomland for this discussion. I want to thank my colleagues at the Bildner Center, Nancy, Karen, Jenny, Darcy, Hannah, and Yvette for all their efforts to make this happen. And my very special thanks to Josh Lambert for kindly agreeing to discuss this book with me today. He's just one of the smartest people working in the field of modern and contemporary Jewish culture in the United States. And I know he's going to ask me really thoughtful questions. And so now to turn to this question, this is actually what was an unusual book, at least for me, in that it was a commission. And what happened was one day I got an email from an editor at Oxford University Press who said, we have a series called Biography of the Language, and we'd like to have a book in the series on Yiddish. Would you like to write it? Well, that's a really interesting offer. But before I could respond, I had some questions of my own. And the first one was, if this is a series, does the book have to follow a certain rubric, a certain structure, which is often the case when academic presses publish books in series? There's meant to be a certain level of conformity, at least in the way they're organized. And the editor wrote back, said, no, you're actually supposed to come up with your own approach. And if you take a look at the other books in the series so far, you'll see that they're organized a little bit differently, each one. Which I did. I went and looked. There's a book on German and there's a book on Dutch, and each one's structured somewhat differently, but they are basically histories of the language, which got me thinking, so why is this called Biography of the Language? Or, as you asked, that seems a curious kind of title. Why not just say Story of the Language, History of the Language, something like that? And I noticed that when I was looking for these books and I typed into a search engine, biography of suddenly a whole list of book titles come up, which are not books about people, which of course is what we conventionally think a biography is about. But they're about all kinds of things, a building, a microbe, a planet, a river. I mean, the list just goes on. And I thought, what's with this? Is this just some kind of, jazzy marketing ploy that sounds just more engaging than a history or a story of something? So I wasn't quite sure what to make of it at first, but I thought, when it comes to languages, we actually do sometimes talk about them as if they were people. We anthropomorphize them. And for example, we talk about languages as being in families. We talk about languages dying. And the more I thought about it, I thought that's, instead of this just being something, nominal, a biography of a language is actually a very provocative idea. And certainly when it comes to Yiddish, the anthropomorphizations are quite extensive and quite wide-ranging. Some of them are very productive and creative. Some of them are really problematic and disturbing. And I thought, if I write this book is going to have to address that because it will be a way of addressing what I think is really key if you're going to tell the story of Yiddish, is that it's not only the story of the language, but the story of how people have talked about it, how they've conceptualized it, how they've scrutinized it, and how they've imagined it. And so that's what got me to write this book.
It strikes me as you say that, I hadn't thought about it before. Part of what makes the book work so well for me is that it addresses a lot of the desires or the ideas that people bring to the language. And I hadn't thought about this before, but that editor woke up that morning and they had an idea about Yiddish, right? They had an idea that Yiddish fit into this series, which we shouldn't take as inevitable. That an editor at Oxford would think one morning, you know what we really need, along with our biography of German and Dutch, also a biography of Yiddish. So I wonder if you can say something about what it means to you that Yiddish has that sort of purchase in this moment, that you know, a respected scholarly editor decided this is something we really need. We need Yiddish to be part of this.
Well, it's interesting that that question actually comes up, because this happens a lot with Yiddish, where when there's something involving a series of languages, it doesn't get attention necessarily, but when it involves Yiddish, suddenly it gets attention. So I remember when, I don't know, around the turn of the 21st century, in New York City, in the machines that you use to buy Metro cards to get on the subway, that they were making them available in multiple languages. And so at a certain point, there was a first batch of languages, you know, Spanish, Chinese, Korean, sort of the main languages spoken by people in New York other than English. And then there was sort of a second wave, including, I think, Polish and Greek and Yiddish. And there was a whole flurry of attention to the fact that, you know, the subway now speaks Yiddish. Well, there wasn't any attention to the subway speaking Greek or the subway is speaking Polish, but Yiddish somehow stood out. And that to me is interesting, that the very stature of the language is something that is worthy of attention and worthy of scrutiny. And that has actually been a part of its history for a considerable amount of time, is that it's not necessarily thought of as just another language alongside the others, but there's something singular about it that draws this kind of attention.
Can you say a little bit about how the frame of the biography, can you give an example or two of how it changed the way you would approach the material? You know, when using that frame, I'm sure it raised new questions or made you feel differently about material that you've looked at before.
So yes, so once I thought, okay, so this idea of biography is very productive, and then how would I actually organize this book, since I'm supposed to come up with my own structure for the book? And the more conventional structures like chronological or geographic or ideological, none of those really were, it felt like they were going to work. And as I thought about it, I thought, okay, if this is a biography, let's run with that. And let's think of how you could write a biography of a language in following a thematic organization that would be organized according to a biographical profile, kind of like, the forms you have to fill out when you have to provide information about yourself: your name, your date and place of birth, your gender, your education, your occupation, and so on. And I thought, that could be a really interesting way to tell the story of Yiddish in a different way, and a way that would integrate the story of the language with the story of how people think about the language. So eventually I came up with a list of 14 of these thematic chapters, starting with date and place of birth, and ending with life expectancy, and working my way in between. And that became just a very, very different way for me to think about what it means to explain Yiddish to somebody.
And I do feel, as I read the book, that I think you have a knack for writing books that are actually very useful to me in my teaching and in my thinking. But I find with this book that it, as strange as it is that there's a chapter on gender or political affiliation, it ends up answering the kinds of questions that I see students drawing students into the Yiddish classroom, right? It's not inevitable that a student ends up in a classroom and says they want to start learning Yiddish or even be interested in it. And I find that some of those approaches are really helpful in the sense that they cut to the heart of what people find interesting about this language. And I wondered if some of those was it very obvious to you from the beginning that gender would be a chapter, political affiliation, and that some others were more mysterious?
So yeah, it's interesting. When I started making the list, it was a shorter list, and it grew partly since I had now created this this rubric that was going to organize the material. Sometimes material that didn't fit in any category I had to make a new category up, and it had to fit a biographical profile. Gender was one that I knew was important from the beginning, and that's because the issues around gender with Yiddish are they're just so interesting, and they're on multiple levels. There's, first of all, just grammatically, gender is one of the structural elements of Yiddish. Every noun has a gender, but the system of gendering nouns is anything but straightforward because so much of Yiddish is resistant to standardization and has a history of localized developments to this day. So how nouns get gendered and how that works tells you a lot about how people have learned this language, and sometimes how very localized it can be, and sometimes how ideologically localized it can be. That a commitment to speaking the language a certain way actually carries some kind of intellectual or ideological value with it, as well as just what you want to communicate in the language. Then there's the fact that people assign a gender to the language, that they think of the language in gendered terms, most often as female, and but not always the same kind of female. Sometimes a seductress, sometimes an old crone, sometimes a servant. It's so interesting to see these associations with the language in these gendered terms as a way of imagining it, and especially imagining it in relation to other languages. Because one of the key things about Yiddish is it never stands alone. It's a language always spoken and understood and read by people who know at least one other language, and often multiple languages. And sometimes the way the language gets gendered is vis-a-vis other languages. So in the early 20th century, part of the association of Yiddish with female was because Hebrew, modern Hebrew, was masculine. And therefore Yiddish was feminine, with, unfortunately, the negative associations of the feminine being weak and the masculine being strong. So you had that. And then there's the gendered use of the language, which also sometimes positions women as the ideal readers for Yiddish, even though often things that are advertised as being especially for women were being read by men as well. But because of gender notions of literacy in the Yiddish-speaking world, women were the ideal reader of this non-elite literature because men read the literature of the elite in Hebrew, in Lashon Kodesh, the sacred language. And what's interesting is this longstanding association of women with Yiddish has started to change in the Hasidic world, at least in the United States, where men are much more fluent and use Yiddish much more than women, who use English much more than the men do. So gender had to be in there, absolutely.
But what about, a category like, I feel like there was a few that I looked at and I just couldn't guess what the chapter would be about. Appearance was an interesting one to me, that from the table of contents, I just had no idea what that chapter would actually be about. Typefaces.
Well, that's good. If it got you asking what this could be, that's actually a good thing. And that was one of the chapters that I didn't know I was going to write at the beginning, but emerged from thinking about the visual aspect of Yiddish. First of all, how Yiddish gets spelled becomes, in the modern period, an issue of fierce debate, rooted in different ideological convictions about the language. So you had, in the first half of the 20th century, you have these competing standards that people are promoting. The YIVO Institute was promoting a standardized spelling system, and it was very much understood as reflecting their secular approach to Yiddish culture. At the same time, Solomon Noach Perlutsky is promoting a different spelling that he says this reflects the traditional religious engagement with Yiddish language, that in fact is the language spoken by most Jews in Eastern Europe, and that was better than the YIVO system. And then over in the Soviet Union, they had a radical remaking of Yiddish orthography, the same way they did with Russian, and it also had strong ideological implications. So that had to be discussed. And then Yiddish has really interesting relationship with typefaces, especially in the early publications of Yiddish in the early modern period. Yiddish had its own typeface. And one of the names it was known by is Weiberteich, which meant that this is the typeface for women. And it was a way of visually marking this as a literature for women. Again, even though men are reading this as well, but it had this official branding, if you will, as associated with women. And then in the 20th century, Romanizing Yiddish, writing Yiddish with the Roman alphabet instead of the Jewish alphabet, became a subject of discussion. And some of the leading champions of Yiddish, like Chaim Shidlovsky, he said, we should modernize this language, and therefore it should use the Roman alphabet because it would make it more accessible. And this didn't really take off in a big way, although we do see a lot of vernacular use of Yiddish spelled with the Roman alphabet. Sometimes it's in, collectibles like, coffee mugs and T-shirts and things like that, where Yiddish words are written in the Roman alphabet. But also in a very, very different way, in the immediate post-World War II period, there were a number of publications in Yiddish that used the Roman alphabet, especially like newspapers and posters, even that were for people in DP camps, Holocaust survivors who were in these displaced person camps in Germany and Austria. And that was because there was no type available. The Hebrew Jewish alphabet font, those had been destroyed during the war. And until those could be replaced, there were these publications that used the available Roman alphabet. So as those started to come together, and I realized the visual element of the language is worthy of thinking about in its own right. Rather than say, just integrating it in here and there, and reminds us that languages have a visual aspect that communicates in its own way.
It's an amazing thing, because once it starts to open up as a topic, you realize how much richness there is to it. But it did surprise me, how by spotlighting different aspects in that way, you could draw out all sorts of aspects of the language that I wouldn't normally group in that way. So I think it's an enormously fascinating experiment. And one of the things that I want to ask you about that the book is so enlightening about is precisely the symbolic value of the language. And as you explain, right, languages have a functional value. We use them to do things, we use them to say things and to live lives. And they also have symbolic values, and you've obviously done so much amazing work on this. And I wonder if you can just reflect on some of the ways that the symbolic value of Yiddish has changed and transformed in very powerful ways through history. It seems to me that as much as other languages have a range of symbolic values, there's something about Yiddish where it feels like it can mean so powerfully and so differently to different people.
No, it's a key question, and partly because Yiddish is this language always in a relationship with other languages. The relationship is never parallel. Rather, the languages have a complementary relationship, and they also have a hierarchy. So someone might speak Yiddish at home, but speaks a different language at school, a different language at work, a different language with neighbors who aren't Jews. The language of the state might be different. Cultural languages that one might study, yet another one. And you can wind up being like, some Jews in parts of Eastern Europe in the first half of the 20th century. You are engaging with a half a dozen or more languages, and that's ordinary. It doesn't mean you have full fluency in them and that you use them equivalently, but they're in a complementary relationship. There's also a hierarchy of prestige. So a longstanding fixture of the hierarchy of Yiddish is that it is beneath Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue, the Hebrew and Aramaic that's used for prayer and for sacred study. That has ultimate prestige in the traditional culture. It can have a different status compared to national languages because it's not a national language. It's the language of in modern terms, an ethnic minority. And typically those aren't placed at the same level. And so its position in relation to other languages can invest it with symbolic values, and those can be all over the place. What I found especially interesting was to see how over time, there's a greater self-consciousness about what this language means on its own, irrespective of what you're saying in it. That the fact that you say something in Yiddish as opposed to Hebrew or Russian or German or English or Esperanto, I mean, the fact that you're choosing to say something in Yiddish carries with it a certain level of meaning. And those meanings can go in all kinds of directions. They can be and they can be positive as well as negative. One of the things I find so interesting is that calling Yiddish Yiddish is actually fairly recent in its history. And one of the many names the language was called for a long time in the, starting maybe late 18th century, but well into the early 20th century was jargon, which is jargon. In Yiddish, it's the word for jargon, which when you refer to language as a jargon, you are taking it down a peg. It's not a proper language. It's not a full language. It's not a healthy language. And yet that became sort of the name of the language for many people, including its defenders. And that tells us about that there's a very complicated sense of its status, that you can actually take a word that for the language it's meant to be sort of derogatory and actually champion it. So the ideas people have about Yiddish become stronger and stronger as issues about language become debated more vehemently in public, and there's always something else that's being talked about as well. I mean, whenever you're talking about language, you're also talking about something else, and it might be ideas about nationality, it might be ideas about religion, it might be ideas about class, but these would inform the investments, positive or negative, that people made in Yiddish as having some kind of symbolic value in its own right.
Can you say a little bit about, you talk in the book about, even in the contemporary world, of the groups of people who are committed to Yiddish, how differently it symbolizes for secular Yiddishists, for contemporary Hasidim, for people with a kind of post-vernacular attachment, that very interesting attachment to the language that you described in Adventures in Yiddish Land. I wonder if you can say a little bit about what you've noticed among students of Yiddish. What's changed? You know, are they bringing different desires to it now than they did 10 or 20 or 30 years ago? Do you see a difference or a change in the way that it's mattering to people in this current moment?
It's a good question. I think first of all, people who are looking to study Yiddish right away, that distinguishes them from people who grow up with the language, right? And so the people who elect to study Yiddish, and they're usually doing this as young adults, or sometimes it's not so young adults, but it's an adult's decision, and it's a voluntary decision. And it is motivated by some desire. And those desires are all over the place. There are people who are interested in this as a language that takes you into the past, into the East European past, which could be the religious past, it could be the radical past. Those are equally attractive, and sometimes both are attractive to the same people. Sometimes they only want one. There are people who associate Yiddish with something alternative, which could be alternative politics, could be alternative sexuality, could be alternative culture. That's a very interesting development that was, I would say, when I first started getting involved as a student of Yiddish myself about 40 years ago, I was just beginning to coalesce, and now that's a major attraction for some people to the language. There are a growing number of people who aren't Jews who are interested in Yiddish, and especially we see this for example, in Europe, in Germany, in Poland, other countries that where Ashkenazi Jews had been a major presence and now are a minor presence, but the interest in the Jewish past of these countries has drawn a lot of people who aren't Jews to learn the language, and for a variety of reasons. It might be for artistic reasons, for being able to perform Yiddish songs. It might be for scholarly reasons. Germany's become the place to go if you want to study early Yiddish. And the reason is, if you want to understand early Yiddish, you have to know Middle High German. There's a lot more people who know Middle High German in Germany than there are elsewhere. Makes sense. This kind of array of interest in the language it's actually very exciting. And I would say that for me, and also for students that I've had at Rutgers, who then go to an intensive Yiddish program, which might be in New York, it might be in Tel Aviv, it might be in Vilnius, it might be in Berlin, it might be in Sydney.
I have to say Amherst.
Amherst. Oh, of course, Amherst. How can I forget Amherst? But all these places all around the world. And part of the excitement is meeting people who are drawn to this language for reasons you never thought of. And that becomes part of the culture of learning Yiddish in these academic settings, is that you are encountering this range of interests of the students and the range of possibilities that you're studying. So when you study, like I remember, when we would study Yiddish songs, 1 minute we're singing an anarchist anthem and next we're singing a Hasidic song. And I remember once thinking, that just wouldn't happen when those songs were originally written. The anarchists weren't going to sing the Hasidic songs, and the Hasidim would have nothing to do with the anarchists. But here we are singing both songs with equal interest and fervor and excitement, and that's creating a new engagement with the culture as having this range of possibilities.
I want to just mention to everyone listening that in a few minutes we'll open up the conversation a little bit and try to involve some more of your questions. So if there's something on your mind, now's a good time to probably start thinking about writing it into the chat. But I'll ask another question before we do that. And the question that I want to ask is about the field of Yiddish, which the book does an amazing job, sort of by the way, surveying. And so much of there's so many of the scholars in the field whose work I admire, who you've been able to integrate some of their work into this in what becomes this very broad survey. And I guess I'd ask you to think about, as you sort of contemplate this survey of the field, where do you see areas of real need on the scholarly level of people to engage in projects of translation or of scholarship? Where do you feel like there are untapped areas of Yiddish studies that really, sort of need that attention?
Well, I think part of what's great about studying in the field of Yiddish is that it's not over-researched. Even major writers have never been subject to a level of scholarship that, in other literatures, there would be a whole school of study of them, and Yiddish not so much. And it's just because, numbers of people who are turning to the language. Linguistically, there's so much interesting work going on now that we'll continue with how people are learning the language, how people have been changing the language. This includes studying Hasidic use of Yiddish, but other people as well. And again, there's a lot of room for growth. The relationship of language to culture and the different places that the language takes people culturally is also an area where there's much work that has been done and much more work that can be. I think it's one of the things that people who start studying Yiddish for academic purposes find really exciting is there's a lot of room to do interesting and important work in the different aspects of where Yiddish can take you. I'm
going to ask one more question, which is a question that maybe doesn't have an answer, but one of the things that I love so much about your work is that in your attention to post-vernacularity, in the way that you understand the language in terms of all the different ways that many different groups of people and individuals engage with it. It's not very prescriptive about the language. It's very sort of open, at least in the way that you write your work. It doesn't come off as judgmental, even of things that we might think of as less respectful or less full engagements of the language. And I think that's incredibly valuable and so important. But what I sort of want to ask is, are there some uses of Yiddish that are just nails on a chalkboard for you? Is there something that you really just can't stand when people do?
Yes, and I'm not going to tell you what they are. But that's because I don't see that as my job. I mean, if I tell you what I like and I don't like, well, that tells you about me. I'm not that interesting. Yiddish is much more interesting than I am. And I actually think it is helpful, including to me, to cast the net wide. And so, like you mentioned, this sort of fragmentary use of Yiddish. And in my earlier work, I wrote about the material culture of Yiddish, of all these collectibles that have Yiddish words on them. And a lot of them are, I think, are in questionable taste. I have to admit that, people were giving me these things as gifts because I was studying Yiddish in graduate school, and here's a coffee mug with something stupid written on. And at first I just reviled these things. And then I thought, wait a second, my inner anthropologist said, this is a cultural practice. You need to understand it in its own terms. And I think that that's really key. What does it mean to have this engagement with Yiddish that's fragmentary, that associates it with the vulgar in both sense of the term, not only in questionable taste, but also common And I actually think I developed an appreciation for what that cultural activity is. If that were all Yiddish culture was, it would be quite diminished. But frankly, if all Yiddish culture was sitting around reading avant-garde American Yiddish poetry, which I adore, that would be a limitation too. And I think the challenge for somebody thinking about a language full court is those are activities that people are equally invested in. At a certain level, you have to take that in wherever your preferences may lie. And that, I think, is part of what makes looking at this language so very, very interesting for me.
I think that's so beautifully said, and it really is important. I mean, so many of the reasons we connect with a field of study are personal, and it is true that, you know, for me, reading poetry connects me to the language, but at the same time, you have to realize that that's not, you know, people were ordering sandwiches and having fights and doing 1,000 other things, and that those are valid uses, and so are even very strange ones that we sometimes find ourselves confronting. I want to make sure that we have time to include a lot of questions from all the people who are gathered here to hear about this book. So I think that maybe now is a good moment to turn to a few of them. And there are definitely some that have come up that I was absolutely expecting, which is great. But I want to say to Professor Sinkoff, do you want to jump in and help us to sort through the questions at all, or does that make sense?
Yes. So I thought I would make your lives easier because it's hard sometimes to watch the chat and engage in the conversation. So I kept track of the chat and I jotted down. There are a lot of really wonderful questions, some more, I guess, what one might expect, but a lot of new ones. So if you don't mind, I'll pose them. And then Josh, if you see that I've missed one or there's one that you think is, more apposite to things you want to talk about, just tell me. Okay, so we'll do it that way. I want to just mention to everyone that both Professor Shandler and Josh Lambert both are working so productively and prolifically in the field right now. So there might be a question you might want to, also orient towards Professor Lambert. But I think we can start in a way with origin stories with Professor Shandler, which you didn't really, some people do want to know, and then just lead a little bit to the language wars, which you alluded to. Mm-hmm. But even before we start that, I think it would be important for many of our listeners for you to define the word post-vernacularity, yes. Because it really is your word, and it's a word that has been lexicalized for all of us in the field of Jewish studies, and probably beyond Jewish studies. And it just rolls off our tongue. Like, we know what post-vernacularity is, but I think it'd be helpful to tell people what a vernacular is and then what a post-vernacular is. Okay, thank you. No, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I realized at a certain point we're batting this word around like, oh, everybody knows what that means. Of course, actually they don't. So, the book I wrote before this book, this biography of Yiddish, is a book called Adventures in Yiddish Land. And it was a book that I wrote because I felt a very urgent need as a student of Yiddish to understand Yiddish after World War II in its own right. Because at the time, people tended to discuss Yiddish post-war, post-Holocaust as what it was no longer. And I felt that wasn't helpful, and it wasn't entirely accurate. There were interesting things happening in their own right. And what I saw happening across the board among Hasidim, among secular Jews, among native speakers, among non-Jews learning the language, among you name it, there was a new kind of engagement with the language that had come to the fore. And that was a new kind of deliberate value of the language that I called post-vernacular. So vernacular, of course, means the language of daily life,
right? So right now I'm using English. It's my vernacular, right? Post-vernacular language is a language or a mode of using a language where the fact that you're using that language has meaning above and beyond what you're actually saying or writing in it. So, I'll tell you my favorite example is a recording that was made around 1950 in New York by Moshe Kusevitsky, who was a very famous cantor in Europe before the war. He survives the Holocaust. He comes to the United States and resumes his career. And in this live recording, you hear him say to the audience in English, he says, "I'm now going to sing the aria from La Juive." And what he's talking about is an aria, Rachel comme du Seigneur, which comes at the end of this opera La Juive. It's not unusual that he's singing it because cantors love singing this in recitals. The character's Jewish. It's very emotional. It's written for a tenor. I mean, it's right up their alley. So he says, "I'm now going to sing the aria from La Juive." And you hear the audience like rustling in their chairs. All right. And then he says, in Yiddish, and you hear them laugh and you hear them applaud. And then he starts singing. And when I first heard that, it just, I thought, wow, what's going on here? He said, "I'm going to sing the aria." It's a French aria. It's a French opera, right? No reaction. "I'm going to sing it in Yiddish." It's the same aria. It now provokes this really complicated response. And that's because he's doing it in Yiddish above and beyond what he's actually saying. And it's not the vernacular. The vernacular is English. He made his announcement in English, not in Yiddish. So to me, that's what post-vernacular is, that this commitment to using the language in whatever way has some kind of significance quite apart from what you're actually using it for. So that's post-vernacularity. What's next?
Okay, well, I have more, again, Josh, if you don't hesitate, if you want to riff a little bit. I have a lot of questions.
Well, all I will say is to anyone listening who this is their first time hearing about post-vernacularity, how important, it would be impossible to overstate how important this has become for not just scholars who, like me, who think about American culture, American Jewish culture, but for students really, because when I meet a student who comes into the Yiddish classroom, their own experience of doing that aligns them with thinking about post-vernacularity. So often in the Yiddish summer program at the Yiddish Book Center that I used to oversee for years, that was a place for students to start, really, to think about why are they there, what's driving them to it, what meanings are they bringing to it, and it helped them to open up the whole question, even as they were just working on the very first levels of comprehension of this language. And that in and of itself is so fascinating to me. And once you start to think about it, you see particularly post-vernacular Yiddish just shot through American culture, and you see it obviously in Israeli culture too. I'm sure a lot of people on this call, like I did, watched through the third season of Shtisel, which just dropped on Netflix. And not to spoil anything, but it climaxes with the characters on this show doing this amazing bit where they talk not only in Yiddish, but about Yiddish literature. It's incredible. And it's really, I think it suggests the degree to which the scholarly work that's being done and the cultural activist work that's being done is sort of spreading out and creating new meanings. And it's just an amazing thing. And I think Professor Shandler's work is really a huge part of making that happen. And it's just incredible.
Thank you.
So you did mention Shtisel and popular culture. So we'll go to that in a second, even though we have so many questions. But I just want to make a note. And again, Jeffrey, you kind of said it quickly, but you said the ethnographer in you and you said the scholar in you. And I think that actually is something that could be foregrounded. We in the academy, our job is not to be prescriptivists. We're not supposed to tell people how to think. We're not supposed to tell people how to do. And particularly in the field of Jewish studies, there's and actually in ethnic studies today, women, gender studies, African American, Black studies, Latin and Caribbean studies, there's a real tension between activism, prescriptivism, and scholarship. And you've been a model of the latter, of dispassionate, committed scholarship. And that's why you can ask questions that and I think you too, Josh, do that too. You can ask questions that a lot of other people are reluctant to ask on the grounds that if it's happening, it should be looked at and be asked about. And I think that, again, thinking about students who walk into our classrooms, if you're prescriptivist, they'll turn around on their heels and walk right out. They're coming with all kinds of stuff and they want to learn and they're open to it. So taking that post-vernacular mode and thinking about that as a pedagogue and how to talk to people really opens it up. And I think the fact that there are 400 people on this call speaks to that. So let's just talk about the popular culture question, which is some people want to know the origins of Yiddish and in the medieval period and the relationship to German. And I'm not saying that's not an important question, but there's a lot of work on that already. And there's material in Professor Shandler's book on it too, the origin story, the birth. But popular culture is on a lot of people's minds, shtisel, unorthodox. The Yiddish singing that's coming out of Berlin, Daniel Kahn and others, the Klezmatics, actors and actresses. The Volksbühne had an extraordinary COVID year, which sounds horrible to say, but it has an extraordinary COVID year, Tevye Affendach. So can you address a little bit this relationship between Yiddish, its life expectancy and popular culture, and do that in 2 minutes?
In 2 minutes. Well, I would say there's several areas to watch. One is the engagement of Hasidim and especially people who have left the Hasidic world in films and television, in music, and it's an extremely productive cultural area, including writing as well as performing. That is one of the most creative areas. And it's another area that needs to be studied that is just beginning to have attention to it. Another that I find interesting is translation, not from Yiddish, but into Yiddish. So you mentioned the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof, which is a revival of the translation that was done in the 1960s in Israel, that was revived just like about a couple of years ago, and was like a runaway hit, and would still be being performed somewhere because they had like a world tour planned, and of course that got shut down. And along that were other activities like Daniel Kahn translating Leonard Cohen into Yiddish, or the amazing revival of the Yiddish translation of Death of a Salesman that was done a few years ago, which has the translation itself has a remarkable history because it was illegal, and was done by Joseph Buloff and Leah Katazin, so they could perform the play in Argentina while it was still running on Broadway. I mean, this is a wild story, but the translation's quite remarkable. And when you hear these works in Yiddish, because they're in Yiddish, they take on a different meaning, even though ostensibly the meaning is the same. But how people hear Death of a Salesman, or Waiting for Godot, or Fiddler on the Roof, in a translation that actually does not take it back to Sholem Aleicham's Yiddish. It's its own thing. Those are quite remarkable exercises in the imaginary of imagining Yiddish originals that don't exist. But that's a very productive cultural activity, and it seems so counterintuitive. We expect things to be translated from Yiddish into English or other languages, but to go into Yiddish right away, that catches your attention.
So another question that's come up, which relates a little bit to popular culture, is, but it also relates to gender. The language culture wars in the modernization of the Jews of Eastern Europe have a long history, storied history, beginning in the 18th century. Debates about German, Yiddish, Aramaic, Militza Hebrew, Yiddish, gendered men, women, and continue for a long time. And they still enact themselves today our colleague Ayala Fader has written a lot on the gendered way Yiddish is used in contemporary Hasidic communities. So relating gender and sexuality, so I'm making a jump here. Can you speak a little bit about those issues, about the association of queerness or LGBTQ culture and Yiddish, or at least the appropriation on the part of certain queer activists in the Jewish community with Yiddish?
Okay, so queer Yiddishkeit is, first of all, it's a fascinating phenomenon. I wouldn't call it appropriation, because appropriation means taking something that doesn't belong to you. And that's precisely the point, is that this was starting in the mid-1980s that you started to see, and this is Americans, mostly, almost all of them born after World War II, not native speakers of the language, who identify as gay or lesbian, who saw in Yiddish a language that had some kind of either affinity or some kind of productive juxtaposition to a queer identity. And they started creating works of performance and literature and that brought these two things together. And it was absolutely fascinating to watch happen, because there was nothing predicting that this was going to happen. The Yiddish-speaking world, secular as well as religious, was at the time as homophobic as anybody else. The gay and lesbian movements at the time did not often look kindly on religious or ethnic cultures, because they saw them as incompatible, if not inimical, to being queer. And so the fact that people basically willed this into existence was quite remarkable. And for me, what I found most interesting about it was it gave me a whole new way to think about Yiddish culture, because queer culture by its nature is not continuous in a sort of biological heteronormative way where, Jewish parents have Jewish children, teach them Jewish languages, the children marry Jews, that's sort of the model, the ideal of cultural transmission and linguistic transmission. But queer culture doesn't work that way. It actually thrives on discontinuity. And it occurred to me that, Yiddish culture of the last 100, 150 years is so shaped by discontinuity more than continuity. But as is the case with queer culture, it doesn't undermine it, it actually animates it. And it gives it energy, that the culture keeps breaking down and people say, all right, we have to make something new here. And that, I think, is key for understanding so much of Yiddish in the modern period. Quite apart from the actual queer Yiddish culture, that the value of discontinuity as something energizing is really, and it's so counterintuitive, because the model, and this is true for other ethnic cultures, is this, traditional model of sort of biological continuity, and that has been honored more in the breach in Yiddish in the past, 100, 150 years. So, so for me, that was actually my biggest takeaway from it. Notwithstanding that some of the work is really just brilliant, but quite apart from that, it really inspired a whole new way of thinking about the culture.
That's, I think it's a fantastic insight, really interesting, because certainly traditionalist thinking, whether or not it's pre-modern or modern, always emphasizes continuity, right? And the continuity is the key to survival. And you're suggesting something quite different and using Yiddish as your data point. So on that issue, there's two related questions. One has to do with the relationship of pre-war and post-war Yiddish, and to some degree then the pre-war Yiddish spoken by Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities, and today's, if you can speak to that. And then someone asked a new and very fascinating question, is if women today in contemporary, either ultra-Orthodox Hasidic communities tend to be more educated in English, even though they speak Yiddish maybe at the home, are they still reading their former canon? The Tzenechen, the Weibel Biblach, right? The women's literature that they might have read, or has their canon shifted? It's a little bit out of Yiddish, but it's a very interesting question about the ways in which Yiddish associated with women's writing, women's reading, may in fact, that may not have the same audience. So those are two questions really that relate to traditional culture pre and post war.
Right. So what's most interesting to me about, thinking about Orthodox, Hasidic, or Haredi, sort of ultra-Orthodox Yiddish before the war and after the war, there's a tendency to think of that, the Hasidim are continuing the language and that they're admired for their maintenance of the language. And what I see is that, first of all, their language is very different from the Yiddish spoken in pre-war Eastern Europe. And so I think if you manage to, pluck someone out of Poland in the 1930s and drop them into Borough Park today, and they would start talking Yiddish to Hasidim they would see on the street, they would have trouble understanding them because the language has changed so much in terms of just vocabulary, grammar. It's a different language, which is not surprising. But what is, to me, actually the greater difference is the role of the language before the war and after the war. Before the war, Yiddish was a language that Hasidim had in common with other Jews, especially in Poland, where Hasidic parents could talk to their, communist children in Yiddish, even though ideologically they were worlds apart. They had this language in common. Increasingly, Hasidim certainly in the United States, and I think this happens in other Hasidic communities around the world, Yiddish is used as a gatekeeper. It is a language that separates you not only from people who aren't Jews, but from Jews who aren't like you, who aren't, as they would say, Heimische, that aren't Jews who are like us, in other words, who are Hasidic Jews. And so I have had the experience, and I have watched other people have the experience of going into a Hasidic neighborhood and speaking to a Hasid in Yiddish who will answer me in English, because the Hasid will not speak Yiddish with someone who looks like me. He understood what I said. And this is not an uncommon experience. It's not consistent. I've also had conversations in Yiddish. It's very contingent, but it is increasingly used as a gatekeeper language. In terms of the gendered use of the language, which has changed, the shift of that, it really, as Ayelet Feder says, it marks Hasidic masculinity in this contemporary culture. Women are reading different texts. I'm sure you can still get a copy of the Tzenorena somewhere in Borough Park, but it's not what they're reading. And that's because there is a new literature for women and for men and for children in Yiddish, in English, that is provides devotional direction, provides moral guidance, and also, most interestingly, provides entertainment. And one of the things I found really striking development in recent years was publishing what I would call leisure fiction for Hasidim in Yiddish. And one of these are like adventure novels and historical novels, but written with values that are compatible to the community and by trusted authors. And one of these books at the beginning has a preface that explains the rationale for the book. And they say, sadly, we live in a modern world. People want to read books, by which they mean literature, not sacred tomes, right? Well, we can't let them read what's in English. We can't let them read what's written in Yiddish by secular writers. So we have to create a literature that is appropriate for them by authors that we trust, who have our values in them. And it's actually parallel to developments you see in Christian fundamentalist communities that create analogous versions of mainstream popular culture, like comic books, like movies, that have pious content, right? And the same thing has happened with this emergence of leisure fiction. And then for children, board games, coloring books, you name it, that not only use Yiddish, but are appropriate in terms of content of how the language is presented as embodying this culture that separates you from other Jews, let alone other people.
So I want to, before I make an announcement, I just want to turn to you, Josh. I'm turning as if you're in the room. Of course, you're over there. But if there's a question that, maybe I jumped over, or one that so you'll get the penultimate word, and then we'll let Jeffrey sort of sum up, and then I'll make an announcement.
I mean, one thing I'll say is, I think as you noted, it's natural, and I think welcome, that a lot of people come to an event like this, and what they really want is the answers to their practical questions about where they can start a Yiddish class, or answers to questions like when did Yiddish start, and I think that's very, very reasonable. I think it's a normal thing. And actually, what I feel like I want to say to the people hearing my voice right now is that this new book is really the best book I can recommend to answer those questions. It really is very accessible and very clear, and it addresses all the sort of basic introductory questions you would want, while also giving you a lot of more interesting or unusual parts of Yiddish history and culture to think about. So I really hope that people who feel like they have some basic questions that they want to get answered will really think about getting this book if they can, because I think that's really going to be their best tool. At the same time, as we're living in this moment where the creation of new materials in Yiddish for people interested in Yiddish is really phenomenal. And some people in the chat mentioned that the Duolingo language learning app just published its Yiddish edition, which I had some insight into because the Yiddish Book Center was a little bit involved, and it was years and years in the works, and it's an amazing thing that it exists, and it's free. And anyone listening right now, if you have a smartphone, you can go online, you can download Duolingo, and by the end of that course, you'll be saying full sentences in Yiddish. It's really kind of astonishing.
I was waiting for Duolingo to come up, and I actually went on the site just to see. It's it just was launched. There are over 48,000 users, and it's still in like the beta version. That's fascinating. It's definitely something to watch. And I would say, first of all, thank you for your endorsement of my book. What can I say? I can't argue with that. But I would say everyone should learn Yiddish. And I mean everyone. I don't mean everybody who's Jewish. I mean everyone on the planet. This is just a very exciting language to learn, and right away you start encountering ideas about language and its connection to culture and its connection to people that come at you thick and fast, and is really, really quite compelling. And so there are all kinds of continuing ed programs and summer programs and college courses and apps where you can learn the language. And I think any level of engagement with this language, enriches people's lives. Absolutely.
So I just want to reiterate what Josh said about Jeffrey's book and his other books. While America Watches, I didn't mention that, but it's absolutely magisterial. One of the first books on popular media in the Holocaust, an award winner, and so insightful. And again, brings his sensitivity to popular culture, ethnography, and very weighty subjects, but in an incredibly accessible and well-written way. So go out and get that book too. Bookfinder.com, or your favorite bookstore.com, any kind of secondhand online bookstore, you can find these books. I want to thank Josh Lambert for being such a great discussant. I want to thank Jeffrey for writing such a great book and being such a fabulous public speaker and great colleague. I want to thank all the staff as well, Karen Small, the managing director, Hannah Feldman, Sarah, Darcy, Jenny Gurman, our senior department and center administrator, Darcy Marr for publications. It's been quite a year plus of doing all of our programming on Zoom. We have had great audiences. I'm very pleased, but it is still very strange. We have one more public program this year, and it's related to Yiddish. So if you are happy today, come right back. We would love to see you. The annual Abram Matlovsky Memorial Program, which is funded by the Karma Foundation, is entitled A World Within Worlds, the Music of Anthony Mordechai Tzvi Russell. It will be on April 22nd. It is a combined public talk and musical demonstration with bass opera singer Anthony Russell and moderator Joshua Kuhn, who's an ethnomusicologist from USC. It's co-sponsored by the Department of Music of the Mason Gross School of the Arts and, of course, the Bildner Center. And I can tell you, Anthony Tzvi Mordechai Russell has an extraordinary voice. And in the spirit of Paul Robeson, I think you will happy to listen to him. And he has a very unusual, and I'd say rather avant-garde way of thinking about Yiddish music, the Yiddish musical tradition, and African-American music. It is not nostalgic. So in that spirit of the life expectancy, the going forward discontinuity, you'll hear all that on April 22nd. So please register. To everyone else, I wish you a good evening. Be safe, line up and get your vaccines. Good night, everyone.
And I thank you so much.
Sei gesund, everyone.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.